So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome today's keynote speaker, Paulhus, arguably Canada's current leading active researcher in personality. Del did his undergraduate degree at Carleton here in Ontario, and then completed his graduate studies at Columbia in New York. He followed this with a postdoc at the University of Georgia, and then took a position at the University of British Columbia in 1982, where he has stayed until today with a couple of teaching sabbaticals at UC Davis and UC Berkeley along the way. Del's areas of interest and expertise include self-presentation, questionnaire response styles, interpersonal perceptions of personality and intelligence, and acculturation, and he's perhaps best known for his work on darker personalities. He's published 6 books, over 140 journal articles and chapters, and has given about 150 conference presentations in Canada and around the world. He has also developed 10 widely used individual difference measures. In recognition of his contributions, Del has won numerous awards and research grants, including a Senior Killam Research Award and the Klopfer Award from the Society for Personality Assessment. Please join me in welcoming Del Paulhus.
So I'm going to talk about organizing the dark personalities. There are a lot of them out there. We spend some time trying to see whether they overlap, whether they're synonymous, whether they can be distinguished. And it was a big task, but we've settled on a reasonable taxonomy, at least for the moment. I want to start off my talk, though, by talking about an ordinary man. I don't know if you recognize this guy. Adolf Eichmann, one of the cruelest Nazis during the Second World War. An ordinary, normal kind of guy, finally captured in 1960. And Leonard Cohen, being surprised at the fact that psychiatrists and psychologists could find no mental illness in this fellow, seemed to be perfectly normal in every respect, except for his horrible history of atrocities. And here's the whole poem, so to speak. Its title is All There Is to Know About Adolf Eichmann. Eyes medium, hair medium, weight medium, height medium, distinguishing features, none. Toes, 10. Fingers, 10. Intelligence, medium. And this was the general psychological message, too, that the psychiatrists and psychologists were given. Nothing special about this guy. And so Cohen goes on to say, what did you expect? Talons, huge incisors, green saliva. When we think of somebody committing atrocities like that, your expectations are you're going to meet somebody who looks like a monster. And Eichmann looked far from it, and the best psychological assessments of the time showed no mental illness whatsoever. Now this is an extreme example, but it resonates with the theme of my talk, and that is, first of all, there may be a dark side to otherwise normal people, and second, that dark personalities may not be categorical. They may fall on a continuum, and so we're each a little bit dark in different ways. It's just a matter of where you stand on the continuum. It could even be a normally distributed variable where everyone represents some degree of darkness. So the question is then, what kinds of darkness are there? So we started about 15 years ago to search for the malevolent personalities in the literature, and we tried to be as comprehensive as possible. We got several conclusions. First of all, 3 personalities appeared over and over again in the literature, tended to dominate any discussions of malevolent people. And they were narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Huge literatures on each one of those. The disturbing part of it is when we covered as much as we could of the literature in these variables, it was the same literature. That is, the people who were studying narcissism expanded it to cover Machiavellianism, expanded it to cover psychopathy, and vice versa. So the 3 literatures had grown to virtually overlap with each other. And we said, how can that be, given theoretically they're so distinct? Here's a quick profile from the original sources of what these fellows should look like. Narcissist, the egotistical attention seek. Machiavellian, strategic manipulator. Psychopath, the impulsive thrill seeker. Now there's very little overlap conceptually among those three. And yet the literatures seem to have grown to make them virtually equivalent. So our notion was they've got to be separated one way or another empirically, so we can be true to the original roots, definitions of these concepts. So here they are, the dark triad, the narcissist, the Machiavellian, the psychopath, and the correlations typically are 0.2 to 0.5 in that range. So they're not equivalent empirically, but they are highly correlated, moderately correlated. So we coined the term the dark triad to capture the malevolent side of these three. And back in 2002 then, we said they're theoretically distinct and sufficiently empirically distinct that they should have been studied together. Other people have disagreed with us, suggesting that those literatures should be equivalent because they're the same people. And that, of course, led to a lot of discussion in the literature. So we've got 900 citations to this paper already, and it helps to have people disagree with you because the literature continues. Now, we distinguish here the clinical level. I don't study people at the clinical level. They require professional help. And so for each one of the triad, there are clinical levels that are studied by other people. I study the subclinical level. These are people among us. So the everyday versions, they may be maladaptive in the sense they're aversive interpersonally, but they're not personally maladjusted in the sense of low self-esteem or distress, depression, that sort of thing. And you all are familiar with these, so I'll kind of rush through superficial description of each one of the triad to get onto the interesting stuff, studying them together. Clinical version of the psychopath, impulsive and callous, and that's a bad combination. There's a lot of impulsive people out there. A lot of them apologize for what they do. They try to redress the harm they've caused. If you're callous, you don't care. You did harm, and then you move on. So these people typically spend a lot of their lives in prison, the clinical version. Subclinical can survive, even flourish among us. And so we've got these terms like subclinical psychopath, successful psychopath, white-collar psychopath. These terms refer to people who seem to get along in everyday society, despite scoring relatively high on measures of psychopathy when they are measured outside of prison so far. But a lot of them may be destined eventually to be there. So I call the places where they survive these dark niches in society, and I'll get back to this a little bit. But there are places where psychopathic behavior can be encouraged, it can be rewarded. Being a Canadian, I know a lot about hockey goons. These are players who are chosen specifically for their violent nature. They are out there to punish the opposition players. And so the more nasty they are, the bigger their salary. Turns out, though, that in their private lives, they're also doing nasty stuff to their spouses, to their partners, etc. And there's other niches like this. Drill instructors in the military, they try to toughen up the recruits. So they're really nasty characters, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, the narcissist, I think everybody's familiar. We all know them. Syndrome, sense of superiority, and manifested by constant bragging, etc. At the bottom, according to the clinicians who meet these people and study them in great depth in their office, the reason they're doing that is because of deep insecurity. Now, that may not apply to the kinds of everyday populations that we survey. These narcissists will be more subclinical. And like I say, flourish in some cases. It helps to be a narcissist. Classic case of Steve Jobs, one of the most successful people in the last 50 years in business. Extreme narcissist, but he's exactly what the company needed to push a product that nobody believed in except for him. And he kept on talking, kept on bragging, kept on pushing, didn't give up, and became incredibly successful. Now, I talk a bit about acquired narcissism from time to time. That is, if you're a celebrity, you get told how great you are all day long for years and years, you come to believe it. So this notion is that you may not have been born that way, but you can't help it, really, being rewarded so often for the stuff you do that you become narcissistic. And you can encourage, given that you come to believe it, and some people in society don't agree, then you can have problem behavior with these individuals. We've got a couple of examples here that you may be familiar with, but these are people who were very talented and for many years very successful, were told how great they are, and they turn out to be narcissistic, and it's almost hard to see how they could not be, given their talent and given how rewarded they were. But here's my favorite narcissist. Well, maybe he's your favorite too. But here he is. Let's see if I can do this. What's he doing? I'm number one, or fuck you. Some combination of those two has led to him to believe that he could be president of the U.S. And we've already taken advantage of that by analyzing some of his speeches. So just in the last couple of weeks, there's been enough content, enough verbal content, that we can analyze it with Luke. How many people here are familiar with Luke, the Pennebaker's language analysis program? You throw text in there, and it produces a whole variety of linguistic indicators. So what my student did was compare Trump's speeches, all in the context of running for president, with other Republican candidates, same party, same political party. But his approach produced significantly more first-person pronouns, not too surprising, a lot of I's and E's in there, and more aggressive words. So just in the number of maybe 4 or 5 different speeches in comparison to the other Republican candidates, he's already manifesting his narcissism in his use of language. The Machiavellian. I think most people are familiar with the history. Machiavelli wrote The Prince and other books that recommended advice for politicians to stay in office. You got to manipulate other people, avoid the truth, unless by some coincidence it's going to help you. Flatter important people, and a whole list of different suggestions for staying in power. There's a justification to it. There's a cynicism element to Machiavellianism that may follow from belief in the tactics, or it may precede the belief in the tactics. And that is, most people are ignorant, and you've got to take charge and manipulate them to do what you want them to do. And of course, the Chinese were ahead of the Europeans in this and many other things. Sun Tzu recommended a lot of this stuff a century before, and in particular, he talked about preparing. You want to win your battles, know your enemy, prepare, do research, find out what they are like, how they're going to react. Today's prototype, Bernie Madoff, you may have heard of him, is part of the financial collapse of the entire world by stealing, I believe someone calculated that he's stolen more money from more people than any man in history. And yet people loved him. Everybody who knew him said he's wonderful. He's always smiling and telling jokes, and he's charming. Perfect prototype for a financial manipulator, a Machiavellian character. And if it wasn't for the collapse of the world's economy, he'd still be doing it. So it was only a freak, economic, chaotic event that exposed him. As with most Machiavellians, they can stay in the background and not get caught. So empirical patterns of how the dark triad fit together and overlap to some extent, but are distinctive in other respects. Standard measures that we've used in a lot of our research, the NPI seems to be the measure of choice for subclinical narcissism, especially the grandiose variety. Self-report psychopathy scale, which is one that Bob Hare and I have developed. The manual should be available this summer. It's been disseminated for a long time. I think there's already 250 citations to the scale, even though it hasn't been published. So it's our view that there's a single psychopathy dimension, which differs from other theorists who argue there's multiple dimensions. We have 4 facets, but they're all correlated to produce a latent factor of psychopathy. So correlations from 0.2 to 0.5, again, positive, always positive, but not sufficiently overlapping to say that they are the same thing. And so we've got a bunch of inventories now. Jonason's Dirty Dozen is available. The Short Dark Triad is available. So these are inventories specifically designed to include all 3 of the dark triad. So you can study them at the same time, which is what we've been recommending. You've got to do that. What's the common factor? There's approaching consensus on this, that among the dark triad, what is tying them together, the common factor is a callousness that tends to automatically lead to manipulating others. So it seems that if people recognize their own callousness, lack of empathy, then they see it pays off in manipulating other people. If you're too empathetic, then that gets in the way of manipulating others. So they tend to go hand in hand and collapse when you measure them. But we can come back to that. So our research then was to differentiate, given that the original theories said they were distinct, where our research emphasizes the distinctions then, using questionnaires to predict actual behavioral outcomes, which was a strong emphasis in our work. Just to preview them, they do show distinctive correlates across a variety of unsavory behaviors. There are some where all 3 of the dark triad predict the same thing. Something that involves the commonality among the dark triad. You may have them all predict the same way. That can happen. But we emphasize the cases and design our studies to show when they can be teased apart. So in the original published paper then, we used these measures and found some distinctions. For example, in self-enhancement, the degree of self-promotion among the dark triad is different. We used the discrepancy measures, partialing out informant ratings from self-ratings to get a measure of self-enhancement. Also used a measure that we've been calling overclaiming, where you include You ask people to rate the familiarity of a long list of items, but a significant fraction of them don't even exist. A lot of people claim them anyway. And the people who claim them tend to be narcissistic in nature and some other personality correlate, suggesting that it's measuring self-enhancement. It's a little more objective than some of the other approaches to self-enhancement like social desirability scales. Results then. Whoop. Narcissism correlations with self-enhancement were moderate to large. Psychopathy were there, but smaller. And with Machiavellianism, zero correlations with self-enhancement. And I guess the explanation of the last one is that to manipulate other people, you have to be in touch with reality, know who you are, know what other people are like. So having an exaggerated sense of self is going to get in the way of being a good manipulator. Cheating and fraud studies, so that seemed like a good choice to get started in measuring behavior of the dark triad members. So who cheats at school? Well, we divided it into two different kinds of cheating. Copying answers during exams has a more spontaneous flavor to it. And so it's not surprising that of the dark triad, subclinical psychopaths were the ones who tended to cheat. Maybe I should tell you a little bit about, there's modern technology now to measure cheating among students. Some of you may be familiar with this. But for example, even multiple choice tests, to get the result of your class and their answers to multiple choice tests, you look at the patterns of the wrong answers. The right answers, of course, tend to be very similar. But you look at the wrong answers and you plug them into programs that are available now, and it shows the distribution of similarities. Typically a nice normal distribution of the similarities of the answers of the students in the class. There are some outliers though, and they usually stand out very clearly, a couple of standard deviations above the normal standard curve. And if you take seating plans during the exams, in every case where we look at one of these outliers, pairs of outliers, they were sitting right beside each other. Never fails. Coincidence? We don't think so. We think the copying went on. Now, we need more research to figure out who was copying from whom. It could be a pair of psychopaths. It could be a psychopath picking on a non-psychopath. So there's a variety of possibilities there. We haven't figured out how to distinguish the cheater and the cheatee, but we know the average scores on psychopathy were higher in those outlying pairs of individuals. Their answers were too similar to be believed. Now, plagiarizing is a little bit different. The modern technology, the Turnitin program, how many people know about Turnitin? I think most universities now use it and require students to submit their term papers to this website. And it's beautiful, the results that come back if you've ever taken a look at it. So it shows the paper that was submitted. It colors in different sections of it. It tells you where this sentence came from. Tells you where this sentence came from a previously submitted essay or from a published paper. And there's another blue one down there, so that came from the same place as that blue one. So the coloring scheme is just a beautiful thing to see, and just so clear about the degree of plagiarizing. Okay, personality-wise, it was more Machiavellians. I think psychopaths also scored above average there, but Machiavellians also came into the picture. Why? Because plagiarizing takes a little forethought. You've got a little bit of time to think it over. It's not spontaneous like the copying from the person next to you, although that could be planful to some degree. but very often it is spontaneous. So Machiavellians tended to plagiarize more than non-Machiavellians, and I think the next few slides give these details. What's going on here? I guess I went backward there. Yeah, here are the details, but I'll... Did I cover everything here? So the exam copying, spontaneous. There's the actual data there. Psychopathy for the spontaneous copying, and the results for the plagiarism study. I guess they're not up there. But both psychopathy and Machiavellianism contributed independently there. So different kinds of plagiarists, but they're well represented in the dark triad. So how about fraud? Well, how can you study fraud in a viable way, not make it too threatening, not make it criminal? Well, we figured out one way of doing it. So we do a variety of studies. In one of them, it was an email questionnaire. The motivation was the possibility of winning a lottery. $50 prizes, 3 $50 prizes. So a lot of people then signed up to fill out this questionnaire. But before we actually sent out the email saying, you won the lottery, instead we sent them an email that said, oops, we lost the list of winners. Were you one of the winners? Well, 12 of the 63 students who had not been told they were a winner or not reported that they were a winner. And we had the personality results of these fraudsters, and it was psychopathy. So psychopaths then responded very quickly often to the email saying, oh yeah, I was one of the winners. Sorry they lost the list, but I'm sure I was one of the winners. And so that's the best we can do at actually doing a real world fraud study, but it has the right flavor to it. Aggression. Typical aggression study using the original bus aggression machine, which is blasting people with white noise. And that's considered totally acceptable by most IRBs because young people blast themselves with loud noise all day long. They'll pay to be blasted with loud noise. So, and yet, white noise is not particularly pleasant. It's definitely aversive. People would prefer not to be getting blasted with white noise, but the IRB committees seem to be okay with it. So that's a standard way of studying aggression. And so you move the dials up and down, the length of blast, the magnitude of the blast. Use those as your dependent variables. Results then. It depended on the provocation who was going to aggress. Narcissists aggress after being insulted. Their egos are the most important thing to them. If the other person in the study insults them, says that they wrote a stupid essay, something of that sort, then the narcissist will move the dials up. Psychopaths responded to a different kind of provocation. That is, if they got blasted for no reason during the practice sessions, then they tended to want to get vengeance on the person who did that to them, and so they moved the dials up after that provocation. So it does depend then on the provocation type, which one of the dark triad is going to increase levels of aggression. Voodoo dolls. You know this idea? Comes from the Caribbean originally, I believe, and that is you can get back at your enemies by making a little doll that represents them, take a pin and stick it in there. And the idea is that they're going to feel pain because you're symbolically sticking a knife in them. This is pretty easy to set up in a psychology experiment, and the ethics review board seemed to be okay with this too. So think of someone you hate, pretend this voodoo doll is this person. Show us how much you hate them. And so you've got a wide variety of pins set up very nicely, very inviting. They just are so tempted to use these pins, jab that voodoo doll. And so both sadistic personality, that I'll get to in a moment, and psychopathy were independent predictors of how many pins you stuck in that poor voodoo doll. Sexuality, what has that got to do with the dark triad? Well, you'll hear more details about that from Beth Visser on Friday, but we did a couple of related studies. One we published a while ago asking about people's sexual fantasies, especially rather deviant ones. Paraphilias are sometimes called, so including pedophilia and voyeurism. A variety of these behaviors are considered to be part of the repertoire of paraphilias. And we asked them whether they had fantasized about doing this and whether they had actually carried this out. And it's amazing how many people told us in an anonymous questionnaire the degree of their sexual fantasies, their sexually deviant fantasies. Now, where you draw the line between sexually deviant and normal is not easy, probably cannot be drawn. But nonetheless, we came from an official list of paraphilias, so we thought we were justified. So, it turns out most people have some deviant fantasies that fell into the paraphilia list, and people will admit to these, but only psychopaths have acted on these fantasies. So it was a list of whether you have ever fantasized, and then have you ever acted out on these particular fantasies. Well, deviant fantasies apparently are fairly normal, but acting on them is much higher, and people scoring high on psychopathy scales. What else? International Sex Survey, Schmidt and colleagues found out that in a variety of cultures that psychopaths are poachers. That is, they will steal your mate and have sex with your mate. Same pattern in every one of 45 countries. That psychopaths, people scoring high on psychopathic questionnaires, report having poached sometimes a friend's partner, sometimes an acquaintance partner, sometimes someone they didn't know, but they did know the person had a partner. And there's a couple of explanations for that. Maybe there's more, but at least a couple come to mind. One is that they're highly sexualized. They just want to have a lot of sex. But the second one is that it's a mean behavior. Maybe they're just trying to do the meanest thing they can think of, and that is having sex with a friend's partner. Both of those may be linked to psychopathy. Behavior genetics, so Tony Vernon and his crew have done a series of these studies, but I'll tell you about one because it fits my story pretty well, and that is all three personality traits have clear heritabilities in the range of most personality variables. But Machiavellianism also shows a shared environment effect. So not narcissism, not psychopathy, but Machiavellianism seems to be influenced by their home environment. And so you can picture parents giving advice on how to live your life, and you've got to manipulate people to get ahead. And so it made some sense to us that the strategic manipulators learned that to some extent from their environment. Okay, there are structural models in personality that you have to use to organize any new set of variables you're going to present. Agency communion. Look at that, all three of them fall in quadrant number 2. So that's using the personality variables corresponding to the general themes of agency and communion. I assume people are familiar with that people do two things in life. They try to get ahead and they try to get along, agency and communion. And personality variables were laid out, fall in a circle, the interpersonal circumplex. So then you project, don't include them with your factors, but project them onto the circumplex, and they all fall in the agentic low communion quadrant. So they're actively bad. There is some debate, even among the people who study the circumplex all the time, whether this should be aggression or should that be indifference. And so the field of interpersonal circumplex people, there's a whole society for that meets every year. They debate this issue regularly. But either way, whether it's indifferent or aggressive, I think it captures something common about the dark personalities. I think correlates. Well, it's all in the P scale for the most part. I don't want to call it psychoticism, so I just call it the P scale, and then it maps on to psychopathy. And if you disattenuate, practically synonymous. A little bit of extroversion in narcissists, and a few other things happening there, but a sensible pattern. Big 5 correlates, in a way parallel the I-sync results. If you think about low agreeableness, low conscientiousness, mapping on to I-sync P, then you're getting most of the action there. Those should be negative, shouldn't they? Negative, 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 negative. Sorry about that. So all negative correlates with agreeableness and conscientiousness. Big 6. This turns out actually to be the structure that organizes the dark personalities most clearly. With this factor 6 called HH, which I don't entirely understand myself, but whatever it is, all of the dark triad load on factor 6. And so the big 5 is a little messier, and the results tend to bounce around a little bit from study to study. But it seems like every study done on dark triad and hexaco, that you're getting the dark triad members, the loadings are highest on factor 6, which is honesty, humility. Makes some conceptual sense, and so in thinking about what the dark triad mean, this particular system seems to be ideal. We've studied a whole variety of other malevolent behaviors, revenge. So ask people online. It's amazing what people will tell you online in the middle of the night. They'll tell you some pretty nasty stories. So, sure, you've fantasized about getting back at someone for some slight or some insult or something worse they've done to you. Tell us about that fantasy. So they're given a little bit of space to write in free text. And fascinating stories, just to read them, to analyze them. Got some interesting results too. Most people have revenge fantasies. It's like sexual fantasies. Most people have them, but psychopaths are the ones who act on them. Neurotics fantasize, but they're very reluctant to act. So they're very high on the fantasizing about revenge, but seldom carry it out. And I say here we clarify the motivation for revenge because we ask people how they felt at the moment they did it. They felt good. 6 months later, they were back to normal. They didn't feel worse, but the enjoyment that they got at the moment of revenge, which presumably is what motivates people, was gone. It had dissipated by 6 months later on average when they were telling these stories. Stalking, similar kind of notion. And again, collected data online, asked people whether they had stalked someone. Now this covers a lot of ground these days. Some people just stalk by Googling people every 10 minutes. And so that's a relatively mild version. But other people show up where the other person is expected to be a little more often than you might expect. And other people make phone calls, unwanted emails, etc. Interesting that stalkers break down by gender, and that is, stalkers are male psychopaths or female borderlines. So there does seem to be a gender difference there, representing perhaps traditional sex roles interfering there or playing a role in how you stalk the person that you're romantically can't get over. Laboratory cheating. How much time do I have? Lots? Okay. A coin flipping task was developed by Quebec and Jones. And the general idea is, it's a little bit complicated, but you can program it on your computer and you tell people to press a button to flip a coin to see whether they win the prize. But it turns out that you can press the button more than once, and the first appearance is programmed to have them lose. So everybody loses if they press it once. If they press it again, which by various ways they're encouraged to do implicitly, then eventually, on the third button press, they win. And so a lot of people pressed the button more than once, and it wasn't random. All three of the Dark Triad cheated under low-risk conditions, so it was unlikely they would get caught pressing the button more than once. If you make it a little more risky, that is, there's an implicit message that we could catch you if you press it more than once, then psychopaths continue doing it. But the other two backed off under high-risk conditions. Then my favorite is, let's say you're a Machiavellian, but you have aspirations to become a psychopath. Well, this is how we do it. You ego deplete people. So you have the same task here, the coin flipping task that gives people the opportunity, even encourages them to cheat. Well, if you ego deplete them first, and Baumeister has a whole series of these methods, we use the watching an emotional movie, and they're told, do not show any expression of emotion, either verbally or on your face. And so there's several films that pretty well make everybody cry, like Terms of Endearment was one from the 60s, where the daughter is dying of cancer and people are gathered around watching her die. And it's hard not to show some emotion. If you do, you are ego depleting yourself, because it does take resources. It takes the ego resources to suppress those emotions. So if you put people through that, who were originally Machiavellians, then they start acting like psychopaths. That is, they will now engage in this coin flipping cheating, even under high risk. Didn't think it would work, but I really like that result. All right, some conclusions about the dark triad then. All right. Narcissists brag, psychopaths impulsively hurt others and don't care. Machiavellians manipulate to get what they want. So all three are callous, and I suggested that callous manipulation was probably what they have in common. And they can occur in some classic personalities. So we have emphasized their distinctions, but of course, classic cases very often have all three of the dark triad. Here's a new member. We've welcomed a new member into the fold, the sadistic personality. And again, there was a lot of backlash, you could call it. People said, no, you've already covered that. Psychopaths are sadistic. But if we try to clarify exactly what sadism means, enjoyment of hurting others is a pretty simple definition. But we concluded, and it's not just accidental cruelty, it's certainly not that, and it's not sexual theater. We think about, I'll see the man after whom the term was named, and after whom 50 Shades of Grey has made a lot of money by appealing to something in people who like to hear about people who like to hurt others. Criminal sadists, I don't study those, but I've talked to a couple of professionals who do study criminal sadists. This is a Canadian guy who could be among some of the worst, tortured children before he raped and killed them. Vlad the Impaler, historical example, he put bodies on meat hooks along the border, which helped deter his enemies, and seemed to enjoy it. It was done for instrumental reasons partly, but apparently so there's extreme examples of that sort, and we're not touching any of those. We're talking about non-sexual, non-criminal, everyday sadism. And the more we study it, the more we seem to see it in everyday society. There's a lot of people who enjoy seeing and doing sadistic things that is considered acceptable today. Prison guards get carried away and do sadistic things. Cage fighting, really popular, especially in Canada for some reason, where there's no rules. You go in the cage and one guy comes out. Films, television, video games, they're getting more extreme. This is something from Grand Theft Auto, the world's most popular video game. You can stomp someone to death and do worse things, I've been told, on Grand Theft Auto. You've got very popular television shows. You've got old movies, but there's a lot more modern ones that are more violent, more extreme, show extreme, sadistic behavior. Game of Thrones, apparently, I've been told, I haven't seen it, but it's getting more and more sadistic. The most popular television program among young people. And it does seem like there's an escalation notion here. That is, every year Grand Theft Auto has to be more nasty or people won't pay for it. Every year the movies seem to get more and more cruel, and even television shows. So this struck us that, gosh, why do people enjoy this stuff? Why are people paying a lot of money so they can watch, and in some cases, a lot of video games are first-person shooters. So a lot of young males spend half of their day blowing heads off people. Now, why is that the most common thing that young males will tune into? Maybe after the porn sites. But why are they doing that when they could be doing other kinds of action behaviors online? No, all those video games are primarily about shooting, killing people, and worse. The dark net, you may not be aware of, but there are parts of the internet that you can't get to without certain browsers, like Tor, that will get you to the part of the internet called the dark net sometimes. It's got nasty stuff on there. Child porn, drug exchanges, you can buy any drug you want, pay with Bitcoin. Anti-establishment stuff that may not get published in the regular press. And relevant to my talk, then there's torture sites. You can torture somebody graphically. Horrible images of all kinds. So-called snuff films where people are being killed that were recorded. You don't know whether to believe it's really happening, but it appears that somebody is being snuffed out, and you can watch it over and over again if you like. So all of this stuff is available and popular. Why? Because there's a lot of everyday sadism. Now, there are encouraging contexts. Authorities can encourage nasty, sadistic behavior, sometimes military leaders. In-group favoritism will do that. Hate crimes very often involve an element of sadistic behavior. And in sports. So in hockey games, these hockey goons will pummel somebody's face into a hamburger and get great accolades for doing that. Although it is interesting, if you go to a hockey game and you see that happen, the other side of humanity kicks in eventually. So if someone falls to the ice and is no longer moving, they've been pummeled so much, then the audience tends to go silent. And if they're carrying the guy off, because apparently he's badly injured, and he makes a little bit of a move to show he's alive, then the crowd erupts in applause. So their empathy finally kicks in, but for the first half of that, they were getting orgasmic over the fact that their guy was hurting the other guy badly. And personal revenge seems to be a trigger that almost everybody can relate to. That is, people do us wrong, and they need to be punished for that. And we can fantasize about it, whether it's road rage or some imagined slight that requires that the other person be punished in your mind anyway. For the most part, we don't carry through on these, but many times revenge tends to lead to escalation and sadistic behavior. So we've developed scales to measure the sadistic personality. We've got the VAST, which is now published in Greg Boyle's new compendium. The CAST, a little bit more broad. It includes 3 subscales, these 3. Direct sadism, that's physical, direct physical sadism, direct verbal sadism, and vicarious sadism, where you just enjoy other people getting hurt. They're all highly positively correlated though. So people who like to watch other people getting hurt also report that they enjoy physically hurting other people. So they're not independent, they seem to be capturing some common commodity. But how are you going to show sadistic behavior if we're trying to show behaviors for each one of the dark personalities? How are you going to do that in a laboratory? After all, hurting people is not what ethical review boards find acceptable in any way. Sometimes they don't like a mean word in a questionnaire. They'll shut down your study for the silliest thing, because you might hurt the self-esteem of somebody filling out your questionnaire. So how on earth are you going to get by showing sadism in the laboratory? Well, we've got a couple of ways. In this paper, published in Psych Science, we've got 2 ways of looking at it. Bug crunching. So apparently the ethical review boards don't like having you hurt people physically, but we got by saying, they're going to think they're hurting bugs, kind of like the Milgram study. They're not. So nobody gets hurt, including any of the bug participants. And so after spelling that out, the ethical review board seemed to be okay with that. And here's what it looks like. This is the bug crunching machine up here. So they take these pill bugs out of these containers, put it in the top like that. Then they have to press down physically, so it takes a little bit of effort, and it's a real crunching sound. And sometimes people smile when they do that. A lot of people say, "Give me more." Other people said, as soon as they heard anything about the fact you're going to be harming bugs, "I'm not in the study anymore," and walked out the door. I love the fact that there's variance on this. Some people ask for more bugs to crunch, other people say this is so horrible that I don't want to be anywhere near this room anymore. 30% were willing, that's the next study. So let me just finish off this one. To anthropomorphize it a little bit, we gave them cute little names. I don't know if you can read them. But this bug is called Muffin. This bug is called Tootsie. This bug is called Ike. So they all have cute little names. So you are crunching Ike. You're crunching a symbolic person. And so a lot of them said, 30% of them said they were willing to do that. Let's see. Yeah, so our scales, our everyday sadism scales, the VAST, correlated with willingness to crunch the bug themselves. Now, the other study I think is important too as part of this package. It showed that people scoring high in sadism are willing to work, put in extra effort for the opportunity to blast other people with white noise. Not just willing to do it because they happen to be there in the study, but we give them an extra task to do that takes 15 minutes. And we tell them, it's kind of boring, but at the end, you can blast somebody. And indeed, we thought this was important to show the appetitive nature of everyday sadism. That is, it's not just, I don't care, like psychopaths. It is working to have the opportunity so you can hurt other people. It's an appetite. And sadists can spend the whole day searching for somebody to hurt. I was talking to somebody studying criminal sadists, and he said it's distinctive from other kinds of criminal motivation by the fact that if you look in the trunk of their car, they've got all the tools ready. They've got the rope, they've got the axe, they've got the knives, and so they are fantasizing, they're looking forward to this opportunity to find a victim. Totally contrast with psychopathy, who just impulsively do things and don't care what they did. So that was the second study that formed that package. Animal cruelty, actually I added this because I was just interviewed about something going on in Ottawa down the road, and that is somebody is mutilating cats. And it's pretty clear when they find these cats that they've been tortured. And the news reporter asked me, how is this possible? How can human beings be doing this to people's pets? It seems inhuman. And so I talked a little bit about a general willingness and tendency to do sadistic behavior. According to Pinker's book, it's been diminishing. We wrote a chapter on this recently too. Historically, it's been diminishing. It used to be that torturing cats used to be a public thing in town squares. People gathered to watch this. It's not happening as much anymore, but some aspects of animal cruelty are still common. Cockfighting and dogfighting, all throughout the world, there are little groups of people who gather together. They have to hide for the most part because they know that other people think it's horrible, including the authorities, but it's worth it, the enjoyment they get out of this, to see these animals tear each other to bits, to spend their time doing it. Cats, I suppose, are the easiest victims. If you have a propensity for being sadistic to people, it's not going to be easy to do that without severe repercussions. But it's easy to find a stray cat or dog and be very cruel to it if you want to get your sadistic impulses out on something. And some people may have heard of the double triad, the supposed childhood precursors to adult psychopathy, and one of them is cruelty to animals. Here's an example of a guy, Michael Vick, who extremely talented athlete, good-looking guy, very rich. What does he do in his spare time? Where's my slide here? Is it missing? I'll have to tell you about it, I guess. What does he do in his spare time? While he was the hero of many Americans, being paid millions of dollars to do it, in his spare time, he was running a dogfighting ring, organizing it. He was on his ranch, and he paid for it for the most part. And he was the one who killed the dogs with his bare hands if they didn't perform. If they didn't win the fights, they lose. And so this kind of cruelty was so astonishing in a guy who has everything. But he got put in jail for that for 5 years, I think it was. And when he came back, he didn't do it anymore. But he was still as talented and still got millions of dollars for playing football. We did a lot of survey results asking people about their sadistic tendencies and the correlates thereof. I won't go into all of these, but similar patterns for males and females. There's a main effect for being male on all of the dark triad. But the patterns within gender are pretty much the same. Enjoying a variety of violent media seems to be all correlated. So if you like the cruelty in one, you're going to like the cruelty in the others. Predicted by the cast, which is one of our sadistic tendency scales. And these people did report a background of fire lighting, vandalism. So there's something interesting going on there in these people. They like to see things blow up, they like to see things burn down, and they like to vandalize, which is, what is that? You're purposely damaging other people's stuff, and that's what is the intrinsic motivation. You're not expecting to get a reward for that. It's just, it's fun to do for some people. And we tried to slip a few sexual sadism items into our surveys, but for the most part, we weren't getting much variance on our 20-year-old students with respect to their sexual behavior. But we did get enough variance on the mechanical Turk study to show that we think there is a connection between liking a bit of sadism in your sexual behavior and general sadistic tendencies. Now this was part of a big debate because you're familiar with S&M communities, sadomasochistic communities. These people are very private because they know a lot of people abhor this kind of notion. They get together and sadistic people or the masochistic people. But the argument from a lot of social scientists was, there's actually no sadism there. This is just sexual theater. This just spices up your sex life. And a lot of people's sex lives, I guess, need spicing up, and this is one way of doing it, is to act out a little story with your partner or with somebody else. And so the argument was there is no sadism in S&M communities. It's just sexuality being boosted up a little bit. But we did find modest correlations, positive correlations between our general sadism measures and reports of people enjoying playing rough and similar kinds of things, being tied up and hurt a little bit during sex. But this is important too, that general personal adjustment measures do not correlate with any of the dark triad, and neither does intelligence. I was going to have a slide on that, but so self-esteem, depression, no, it's average. It's not lower than average, but this motivation, sadistic motivation, is something special that's independent of just generally feeling good about themselves. And independent enough, I shouldn't say relatively independent, I should say sufficiently independent of the dark triad to warrant a separate measurement. So that makes it a dark tetrad now that we have 4 of them that are positively correlated but able to be distinguished psychometrically. What do we got here? Internet trolls. This is an interesting phenomenon, fairly recent. So you're on a website and you're enjoying talking about classical music, talking about backyard gardens, talking about how wonderful Justin Bieber is, whatever you like, and then after 7 or 8 comments, somebody jumps in and says, "You're all a bunch of idiots." Starts a fight for no apparent reason. And so these are called internet trolls, who troll the internet looking for people to upset. And people do get upset pretty quickly, some people, that start a little fight. So the recommendation, don't react, don't feed the trolls, is the general recommendation. They just love the fight, so don't fight with them, just ignore them. But who are they? Turns out they're sadists of the internet. And so we published this paper that got a lot of citations. And we showed by asking, looking at various mediators, that it really was enjoyable for them. They were doing it for the pleasure. Something made them happy when they upset other people who were comfortable in what they were doing. Especially people who were agreeing that something was fun or nice or appealing. This sets off trolls, apparently. They don't like it when other people are enjoying life. Predicted by scores then on the everyday sadism measure. All right, some conclusions then. People tend to lump together bad personalities. That seems to be a general human tendency. It's part of they're the bad guys, we're the good guys, and that organizes your world in a comfortable way. So those bad people, the outgroup, they've got all these dark personalities all lumped together. So we argue then the dark tetrad, they need to be studied as a constellation. Otherwise, you're not sure which one of them you're measuring. They're all going to be confounded. And there could be large literatures studying one of the tetrad and getting interesting results because it's confounded with one of the other members. And they may have drawn wrong conclusions for years because they didn't partial out or put them in a regression equation, somehow deal with the fact there's some other malevolent personalities that are correlated, overlapping. And so this notion that goes back to the beginning, and that is, if you only study one variable, eventually it's going to creep a little too large. It's going to cover things it shouldn't be covering. Natural tendency, perhaps you get a random correlation, a chance correlation. So you include that in there, and if you study it long enough, you got a whole bunch of chance correlations. Or perhaps you are picking up one of the other members of the quartet and believing that you're measuring the one that you've spent your whole life studying. And I know I sometimes go to the meeting of the psychopathy researchers, SSSP I think it's called, Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy, and they're dedicated to studying one variable, psychopathy, but it's amazing the things that they include. I sometimes have arguments with them saying, well, these are not all psychopathy. They want to just say they're variants of psychopathy. And I suppose that boils down to a semantic question, but it makes a big difference if you're going to call a whole variety of things psychopathy. It seems better to me to call it by the name that has a more specific history, more specific theoretical history, and consider that overlap and those differentiations. Why do the D4 exist? Why are they among us? Well, the usual answer. Whoops. What is the usual answer? There's the usual answer, the evolutionary argument. They must have reproductive success. They must have a little bit of an advantage in their reproductive styles. It seems to work for them. It may not be the same as your typical average reproductive style, but each one of them, if they're still in our gene pool. And there are arguments that if you call them parasitic personalities, maybe it's not reproduction so much, but there are niches in our ecosystem that we call society, modern societies. And we can harbor enough parasites. I think Dr. Kenner made an estimate in simulation studies of between 2 and 5% of society's members can be parasites. So their personalities can allow them to exploit others and without doing the work of society. And so I've mentioned this a couple of times now, there are places where each one of them can survive enough to reproduce and stay among us. I've got a few other topics here I can talk about if you want to throw these at me during question period. A few other interesting things that we've been talking about in our lab and elsewhere. And I want to acknowledge my students and people who have contributed to the dark triad and dark tetrad literature. A few of them are here. We've got Jones and Jonason. Those names sound suspiciously similar. I don't think I've ever seen them in the same room at the same time. Is Jonason here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Is Jones here?
Not even the same country.
I haven't seen him.
Yeah. Just as I suspected. You never see them together. Tony Brennan and the students really come on strong recently and really added a lot to this literature. I think Egan is here. Where are you? There he is. He's contributed to this literature. Chabrol and Davies. Davies developed the original sadism scale. I think he's Irish, isn't he? Do you know Davies?
I don't know.
And we developed and expanded the scale from his. And don't forget about the Friday Symposium. There's actually two of them, but the one that I'm chairing has other members who have contributed some new stuff to the literature, so I hope you can make it to Friday's Symposium.